The clock on the wall showed 11:47 p.m. as Maya wiped down the last table at Romano's restaurant. Her feet hurt from standing for 12 hours straight, and her back ached from carrying heavy trays all day. The fancy Italian restaurant in downtown Manhattan was finally empty except for the cleaning crew and a few waiters finishing their closing duties. Maya looked around the elegant dining room with its white tablecloths and sparkling chandeliers. 3 years ago, she never imagined she would be working here as a waitress. Back then, she was studying music at one of the most expensive schools in New York, dreaming of becoming a professional pianist. Her teachers said she had real talent. Her fingers could dance across the keys like magic, bringing classical pieces to life in ways that made people stop and listen. But dreams don't pay rent or buy food. When her father lost his job at the factory, Maya had to make a choice. Continue her expensive music education and watch her family struggle, or drop out and help support them. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. She left school, said goodbye to her piano dreams, and started waiting tables to send money home to her family in Ohio. The grand piano in the corner of Romano's restaurant seemed to mock her every day. It was a beautiful black Steinway, the kind of instrument she had only dreamed of playing during her student years. The restaurant brought in a professional pianist 3 nights a week to entertain the wealthy customers who could afford to spend more on one meal than Maya made in a week. She watched jealously as the pianist's fingers moved effortlessly across the keys, playing the same classical pieces she once knew by heart. Maya wasn't allowed to touch the piano. The restaurant's rules were clear. Staff members were there to serve food and clean tables, nothing more. She had asked the manager once if she could play during her break, just for a few minutes when no customers were around. He laughed and told her to focus on her real job. "Dreamers don't last long in the restaurant business," he said with a cruel smile. Her hands, once soft and nimble from years of piano practice, were now rough and calloused from washing dishes and scrubbing tables. She used to practice 8 hours a day, her fingers flying across the keys with precision and grace. Now those same fingers ached from carrying heavy plates and wiping down surfaces with harsh cleaning chemicals. Sometimes she would catch herself moving her fingers like she was playing an invisible piano, muscle memory refusing to let go of what she once loved most. The other waiters at Romano's were nice enough, but they didn't understand her background. To them, she was just another girl working her way through life in the big city. They didn't know about the countless hours she had spent practicing scales, the competitions she had won, or the scholarship she had earned to study at one of the best music schools in the country. They didn't know that she could play Chopin and Mozart from memory, or that music professors once said she had the potential to perform at Carnegie Hall. Maya's apartment was a tiny studio in Queens that she shared with 2 roommates. Her old keyboard sat in the corner, covered with dust and boxes. She rarely played anymore because the sound bothered her roommates. And besides, the cheap electronic keys felt nothing like a real piano. The magic was gone. The passion that once drove her to practice until her fingers bled had slowly faded into a dull ache of regret. Every night after work, she would walk past the music school where she used to study. Through the practice room windows, she could see current students working late into the night, their faces lit up with the same determination she once felt. Some nights she would stop and listen to the faint sounds of piano music drifting from the building. It made her heart hurt in a way that was hard to describe. Her parents called every week asking how she was doing in New York. She always told them she was fine, that she was working toward her dreams. She couldn't bear to tell them the truth, that their daughter, who once filled their small house with beautiful music, now spent her days refilling water glasses and memorizing dinner specials. They were so proud when she got into music school, bragging to all their friends about their talented daughter who was going to be a famous pianist someday. The worst part wasn't the physical exhaustion or even the rude customers. The worst part was feeling like she was disappearing a little bit more each day. The girl who used to lose herself in music for hours, who could express emotions through melodies that words couldn't capture, was slowly being replaced by someone who only knew how to smile politely and ask if everything was okay with the meal. Maya had developed a routine to cope with the sadness. Every morning before work, she would sit on her bed and play air piano, running through the pieces she used to know perfectly: Chopin's Ballade No. 1, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, Debussy's Clair de Lune. Her fingers would move through the familiar patterns while she hummed the melodies softly. It was her way of keeping the music alive, even if she couldn't actually play anymore. The restaurant customers were mostly wealthy business people and tourists who treated the staff like they were invisible. Maya had learned to smile and nod no matter how rudely they spoke to her. She had been yelled at for bringing the wrong wine, cursed at for taking too long with an order, and ignored when she tried to be helpful. Rich people, she had learned, often forgot that waiters and cleaners were real people with feelings and dreams. Some nights, when the restaurant was particularly busy and stressful, Maya would find herself humming while she worked. Music was the only thing that could calm her mind when everything felt overwhelming. Her co-workers thought it was just a nervous habit, but for Maya, it was survival. The melodies in her head were the only connection she had left to the person she used to be. She had started to accept that this was her life now. The dreams of performing on stage, of sharing her music with the world, seemed childish and unrealistic. Real life was about paying bills and helping family. Real life was sore feet and demanding customers and falling asleep exhausted every night. Music was something rich people paid other people to provide for their entertainment. But sometimes late at night when she was cleaning tables and the restaurant was quiet, Maya would look at that beautiful piano and remember what it felt like to create something magical. She would remember the feeling of her fingers finding just the right touch to make a melody sing, the way time seemed to stop when she was completely lost in a piece of music. Those memories hurt, but they also kept a small flame of hope burning inside her. Maya didn't know it yet, but her life was about to change in ways she never could have imagined. Tomorrow night, a man would walk into Romano's restaurant who would force her to confront everything she had given up. Tomorrow night, the piano in the corner would finally call her name, and she would have to decide whether to answer. Richard Blackwell stepped out of his black Rolls-Royce and barely glanced at the doorman, who rushed to open the restaurant door for him. At 55 years old, he was worth over $8 billion and owned everything from tech companies to real estate empires across 3 continents. Money had never been a problem for Richard, but respect and fear, those were the currencies he truly valued. His expensive Italian shoes clicked against the marble floor as he entered Romano's restaurant, followed by 4 business associates, who hung on his every word. Richard was the kind of man who expected perfection from everyone around him, and he usually got it. Restaurant managers would clear entire sections for his arrival. Hotel staff would work overtime to meet his impossible demands. Most people bent over backward to please him, not because they liked him, but because they were terrified of what would happen if they didn't. Richard had built his fortune by being ruthless in business. He bought struggling companies, fired half the workers, and sold the pieces for profit. He had destroyed thousands of jobs and ruined countless lives, but none of that mattered to him. In his mind, weak people deserved whatever happened to them. He believed that money was the only thing that separated successful people from failures, and he had no patience for anyone who couldn't keep up. The restaurant manager practically ran across the dining room when he saw Richard enter. Everyone in the city's restaurant business knew who Richard Blackwell was, and they all knew the stories. He had shut down 3 restaurants in the past year just by writing bad reviews and pressuring his wealthy friends to boycott them. One negative word from Richard could destroy a business overnight. "Mr. Blackwell, welcome back to Romano's," the manager said, his voice shaking slightly. "Your usual table is ready, sir." Richard looked around the restaurant with obvious disapproval. The lighting wasn't quite right. The temperature was too warm. The tablecloth had a tiny wrinkle that annoyed him. But what bothered him most was the silence. Usually, Romano's had a piano player creating a sophisticated atmosphere for the evening crowd. Tonight, the beautiful grand piano in the corner sat empty and silent. "Where's the music?" Richard demanded as he sat down at the best table in the restaurant. "This place feels like a funeral home." The manager's face went pale. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Blackwell. Our regular pianist called in sick at the last minute. We tried to find a replacement, but it's such short notice." Richard's eyes went cold. He hated excuses almost as much as he hated incompetence. "So you're telling me that a restaurant of this caliber can't manage to provide basic entertainment for its customers?" Do you have any idea how much money I spend here? The business associates at Richard's table shifted uncomfortably. They had all witnessed his anger before, and they knew it wasn't pretty. Richard Blackwell didn't just get upset, he got revenge. He would remember this moment and find ways to make the restaurant pay for disappointing him. We'll give you a significant discount on tonight's meal, the manager offered desperately, and complimentary wine for your entire table. Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think I care about your discount? I could buy this entire restaurant with the money I spend on lunch. What I care about is respect and proper service. Maya was assigned to serve Richard's table, though she didn't know who he was when she first approached. She had been working at Romano's long enough to recognize wealthy customers, but Richard was different. He had an aura of power and cruelty that made her nervous before he even spoke. His eyes were sharp and calculating, like a predator sizing up its prey. Good evening, Maya said politely, setting down water glasses for the table. Can I start? You with any appetizers tonight? Richard barely looked at her. To him, waiters and waitresses were just part of the furniture, necessary but completely forgettable. He was still annoyed about the missing piano music and looking for someone to blame for his disappointment. The service here used to be excellent, Richard said loudly, making sure other customers could hear him. Now they can't even provide basic entertainment. I'm beginning to think Romano's has lost its standards. Maya continued serving the table, professionally, even though Richard's comments made her uncomfortable. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but something about this man felt dangerous. The way he spoke suggested he was used to getting whatever he wanted, no matter who got hurt in the process. Richard owned 12 restaurants across the city, though he rarely visited them. He bought them as investments and left the actual running to managers who lived in constant fear of disappointing him. He had fired dozens of chefs, servers, and managers over the years for tiny mistakes. In his world, people were replaceable, and he never thought twice about destroying someone's career if they failed to meet his expectations. The conversation at Richard's table turned to business, but he kept glancing irritably at the silent piano. His associates were discussing a new company they wanted to buy and break apart for profit. They talked casually about the hundreds of workers who would lose their jobs, as if those people didn't matter at all. To Richard, poor people were just obstacles to be moved out of the way. That factory in Detroit is bleeding money, one associate said. We could shut it down and sell the land for 3 times what we'd pay for the whole company. Do it, Richard replied without hesitation. Fire everyone and liquidate the assets. I don't care what happens to the workers. Maya overheard parts of their conversation as she served their meals, and it made her stomach turn. These men were casually deciding to destroy hundreds of families, and they were discussing it like it was a game. She thought about her own father, who had lost his factory job when rich investors decided his workplace wasn't profitable enough. As the evening went on, Richard became increasingly agitated about the missing music. He had planned to impress his business partners with Romano's sophisticated atmosphere, and the silent piano was ruining his evening. He started making threatening comments about the restaurant's future, loud enough for other customers to hear. I'm thinking of writing a review for the city magazine, Richard announced. Something about how Romano's has lost its way and no longer deserves its reputation. The manager was panicking. He knew that a bad review from Richard Blackwell could destroy the restaurant. Romano's was a family business that had been operating for 30 years, employing dozens of people who depended on their jobs to support their families. One wealthy man's bad mood could ruin everything they had worked for. Richard noticed how the manager was sweating and begging, and it gave him a feeling of power that he enjoyed. He liked watching people squirm when they realized how much control he had over their lives. It reminded him why he had worked so hard to become rich and powerful in the first place. Please, Mr. Blackwell, the manager pleaded. Give us another chance. We'll make this right somehow. Richard was about to dismiss him when he noticed something interesting. Maya was clearing a nearby table, and he caught her glancing, longingly, at the piano. There was something about the way she looked at the instrument that caught his attention. It wasn't just casual interest. It was the look of someone who understood music. You, Richard called out suddenly, pointing at Maya. Come, here. Maya approached the table nervously, unsure what she had done wrong. Richard studied her carefully, noting the way she carried herself and the graceful movement of her hands. He had spent enough time around musicians to recognize the signs. Do you play piano? Richard asked directly. Maya hesitated. She didn't want to lie, but she also didn't want to give this intimidating man any reason to focus on her. I used to study music, she said quietly. Richard's eyes lit up with cruel interest. He had just found the solution to his problem, and he didn't care at all about how Maya might feel about it. In his mind, she was just another employee who existed to serve his needs. The seeds of humiliation were being planted, though Maya didn't realize it yet. Richard Blackwell had decided that this waitress was going to provide his entertainment whether she wanted to or not. Richard's smile was cold and calculating as he looked at Maya standing nervously beside his table. He had found his entertainment for the evening, and he didn't care that she was clearly uncomfortable with his attention. In his world, other people's feelings were irrelevant compared to his own desires. So you studied music, Richard said, his voice carrying across the quiet restaurant. What instrument? Maya's hands trembled slightly as she held her serving tray. Piano, sir, but that was years ago. I'm just a waitress now. Just a waitress, Richard repeated with amusement. He turned to his business associates who were watching the conversation with interest. Did you hear that, gentlemen? We have a musician hiding among the staff. The other men at the table chuckled, though they weren't entirely sure what Richard was planning. They had learned over the years to go along with whatever he wanted, no matter how strange or cruel it seemed. Disagreeing with Richard Blackwell was a good way to lose business deals and destroy professional relationships. Maya tried to step away from the table. Is there anything else I can get for you, sir? Perhaps more wine? Actually, yes. There is something you can get me, Richard said, his voice becoming more commanding. You can solve our little music problem tonight. The restaurant manager, who had been hovering nearby and listening to every word, suddenly looked hopeful. Maybe Richard had found a way to save the evening after all. He rushed over to the table, eager to please his most important customer. What did you have in mind, Mr. Blackwell? The manager asked. Richard gestured toward the silent piano in the corner. Our waitress here is going to provide tonight's entertainment, aren't you, dear? Maya felt her heart sink. Oh, no, sir, I couldn't. I haven't played seriously in years. I'm really not good enough to perform for customers. Richard's expression hardened. He wasn't used to being told no, especially by someone he considered far beneath him socially. I'm not asking you, I'm telling you. This restaurant has failed to provide proper service tonight, and you're going to fix that problem. Sir, I really can't, Maya said, her voice getting smaller. I'm working. I have tables to serve. The manager looked back and forth between Maya and Richard, clearly torn. He needed Maya to work, but he also couldn't afford to anger his most powerful customer. The other diners in the restaurant had started to notice the conversation, and several were openly staring. Let me explain something to you, Richard said, his voice becoming dangerously quiet. I know people in this city. Important people who decide whether restaurants stay open or close. I could make sure you never work in any decent establishment again. Not just you, but everyone who works here. Maya felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She looked around the restaurant at her co-workers, the other waiters, the kitchen staff, the manager who had given her a job when she desperately needed one. Richard was threatening all of them because of her. Richard, perhaps we could just order dessert and call it a night, one of his associates suggested gently, sensing that the situation was becoming uncomfortable. Richard shot him a look that could have frozen fire. Are you telling me what to do, Peterson? Because I remember you asking me for a loan just last month to save your company. Peterson immediately went quiet, and the other men at the table looked down at their plates. They all owed Richard money, or favors, which meant they couldn't oppose him even when they wanted to. The manager made his decision. Maya, maybe you could play just one song for Mr. Blackwell and his guests? Maya felt completely trapped. She looked around the restaurant and saw that everyone was watching now. The other customers, her co-workers, even the kitchen staff had come out to see what was happening. All of them were waiting to see what she would do. "I really don't think I can," Maya whispered. "It's been so long since I played on a real piano." Richard stood up from his chair, towering over Maya in his expensive suit. "Let me make this very simple for you. You can walk over to that piano and play something nice for my table, or you can clean out your locker and never work in this city again. Your choice." The cruelty in his voice was unmistakable. He was enjoying this, watching her squirm, forcing her into a situation where she had no good options. Richard had learned long ago that money gave him power over people, and he loved using that power to make others do things they didn't want to do. Maya's co-workers were watching with a mixture of sympathy and fear. They all needed their jobs, and they all knew that Richard could destroy the restaurant if he wanted to. Nobody was going to risk their own livelihood to help her, even though they felt sorry for what was happening. "Please, sir," Maya tried one more time. "I'm not a performer. I studied classical music years ago, but I've forgotten so much, you'll be disappointed." Richard's smile became even colder. "The only thing that will disappoint me is if you keep making excuses. Now move." The restaurant had become completely silent except for the sound of Maya's footsteps as she slowly walked toward the piano. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold them steady. Everyone in the room was staring at her, waiting to see what would happen next. The piano bench felt strange under her as she sat down. It had been months since she had sat at a real piano and years since she had played for an audience. Her fingers found the keys, and she was surprised by how familiar they felt despite everything that had changed in her life. "What are you going to play for us?" Richard called out loudly, making sure everyone in the restaurant could hear him. "Something classical, I hope. None of that modern nonsense." Maya's mind went blank. All the pieces she used to know so well seemed to have disappeared. From her memory, she sat frozen at the piano bench, her fingers hovering over the keys, unable to remember how to begin any of the songs that had once been as natural as breathing. Richard and his associates were watching her with obvious amusement. To them, this was entertainment, watching someone struggle and fail for their personal enjoyment. They had no understanding of what music meant to Maya, or how much courage it took for her to sit at that piano after years of believing her dreams were dead. "We're waiting," Richard said impatiently. "Or are you going to just sit there all night?" The other customers in the restaurant were beginning to whisper among themselves. Some looked sympathetic to Maya's situation, but others seemed to think she was being silly for making such a big deal about playing piano. After all, she had claimed to be a musician, so what was the problem? Maya closed her eyes and tried to remember her grandmother's advice from years ago. "When you're scared to play," her grandmother had said, "just think about the music itself. Let the music be bigger than your fear." Her grandmother had died when Maya was 16, just before she started her serious musical training. The last piece they had played together was Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, a beautiful, complicated piece that her grandmother had loved above all others. Maya had learned it to honor her memory, practicing it until she could play it perfectly even when she was emotional or tired. "I'm going to play Chopin," Maya said quietly, her voice barely audible across the restaurant. Richard leaned back in his chair with satisfaction. "Excellent choice. Classical music for civilized people." Maya placed her fingers on the keys and took a deep breath. She was about to do something she hadn't done in years: open her heart through music in front of strangers. She had no idea that this moment would change everything, not just for her, but for the cruel man who had forced her into this situation. The first notes were about to transform a night of humiliation into something magical that nobody in the restaurant would ever forget. Maya's fingers trembled as they touched the piano keys for the first time in months. The familiar smoothness of the ivory felt both foreign and comforting, like greeting an old friend after a long separation. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the restaurant on her, waiting to see if she would embarrass herself or somehow manage to play something decent. Richard sat back in his chair with a smug expression, expecting to be entertained by what he assumed would be an amateur performance. He had humiliated the waitress into playing for him, and now he was going to enjoy watching her struggle through some simple piece that would prove she was nothing special. In his mind, poor people who claimed to have talent were usually just deluding themselves. The opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor floated across the restaurant like a whisper. Maya's fingers found their way to the familiar melody, almost automatically, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought had failed. The first few measures were soft and contemplative, like someone telling the beginning of a long, complicated story. As Maya played those opening phrases, something unexpected began to happen. The years of washing dishes and serving tables seemed to melt away, replaced by the person she used to be when music was the center of her world. Her posture straightened, her breathing deepened, and her fingers began to remember what they had been trained to do so many years ago. The other diners in the restaurant had expected background music, something pleasant and forgettable to accompany their conversations. Instead, they found themselves drawn into something much more powerful. Conversations died mid-sentence as people turned their attention to the young woman at the piano, who was beginning to weave musical magic. Richard's business associates glanced at each other with surprise. They had expected this to be an amusing disaster, a way to humiliate someone who had dared to resist their boss's demands. Instead, they were hearing music that was genuinely beautiful, played with a skill and sensitivity that none of them had anticipated. Maya lost herself in the music. As the piece developed, Chopin's ballad told a story of struggle and triumph, of dreams that seemed impossible but refused to die. As her fingers moved across the keys, Maya felt like she was telling her own story. The girl who had loved music so much that she practiced until her fingers bled, who had won competitions and earned scholarships, who had been forced to give up everything she cared about to help her family survive. The technical demands of the piece were enormous. Chopin had written music that required years of training to play properly, with rapid scales, complex harmonies, and emotional depths that could only be expressed by someone who truly understood both music and life. Maya's fingers flew across the keys with increasing confidence as the piece built toward its first climactic moment. Richard found himself leaning forward in his chair, his cruel smile beginning to fade. He had expected to hear stumbling amateur playing, but this was something entirely different. The waitress he had dismissed as worthless was playing music with a skill and passion that he hadn't heard since his childhood. Something deep in his memory was stirring, something he had buried for decades. The restaurant staff had stopped working entirely. Waiters stood frozen with plates in their hands, cooks emerged from the kitchen to listen, and the manager forgot all about seating new customers. Everyone was transfixed by the music pouring from the piano in the corner, played by someone they had seen every day but never really noticed. Maya's eyes were closed now, her entire being focused on the music. She wasn't playing for Richard or his cruel demands anymore. She wasn't even playing for the restaurant full of people watching her. She was playing for her grandmother, who had taught her that music was a language that could express things words never could. She was playing for her younger self, who had dreamed of sharing her gift with the world. The piece moved through its various sections, each one more technically challenging and emotionally complex than the last. Maya's hands moved with increasing confidence and power, as the music demanded everything she had to give. The soft beginning had given way to passages of incredible difficulty, with both hands racing across the keyboard in perfect coordination. Richard felt something crack inside his chest as the music continued. The sound of the piano was bringing back memories he had spent 30 years trying to forget. He remembered his mother, who had been a piano teacher before she died when he was just 12 years old. She used to play for him every evening after dinner, filling their small apartment with music that made everything else in the world disappear. His mother had played this same piece, Chopin's Ballade No. 1. It had been her favorite, and she had played it on the last night before she went to the hospital and never came home. Richard had been so angry after she died, so hurt by the unfairness of losing the only person who had ever truly loved him. He had deliberately chosen to forget the music, to bury those memories so deep that they could never hurt him again. But, now listening to Maya play with such heartbreaking beauty, All those buried emotions came flooding back. He remembered what it felt like to be loved, to be cared for by someone who saw good in him. He remembered the boy he used to be before money and power became the only things he cared about. Maya reached the most technically challenging section of the piece, where Chopin demands that the pianist's hands work independently to create multiple, musical lines simultaneously. Her left hand provided a steady, driving rhythm, while her right hand sang out the main melody, with additional voices weaving in and out like conversations between old friends. The other customers in the restaurant were completely silent now, afraid that any sound might break the spell being cast by this extraordinary performance. Several people had tears in their eyes, moved by music that seemed to speak directly to their hearts. This wasn't just technical skill. This was someone pouring their soul out through the piano keys. Richard's carefully constructed, emotional walls were crumbling with each note. The cruel, heartless businessman who had terrified people for decades was being reduced to tears by a waitress playing a piece of classical music. He tried to maintain his composure, but the memories of his mother's love were too powerful to resist. As the piece approached its dramatic climax, Maya's playing became even more intense and passionate. Her entire body moved with the music as she channeled years of suppressed emotion into Chopin's magnificent creation. The piano seemed to sing under her touch, producing sounds that filled every corner of the restaurant with beauty and longing. The final section of the ballad was like a musical storm, with Maya's hands flying across the keys in passages of incredible complexity and power. But even in the most technically demanding moments, every note was perfectly placed, every phrase shaped with musical intelligence and emotional truth. And then, as suddenly as the storm had begun, it was over. Maya played the final delicate notes of the piece with such tenderness that they seemed to float in the air like whispered prayers. Her hands came to rest on her lap, and she opened her eyes to discover that the entire restaurant was holding its breath. The silence that followed was profound and sacred. For a moment, everyone in the room seemed to understand that they had witnessed something truly special. Not just excellent piano playing, but a human soul expressing itself through music in a way that touched everyone who heard it. Richard sat, frozen in his chair, tears streaming down his face, unable to speak or move. The waitress he had tried to humiliate had instead given him a gift he never expected: the memory of his mother's love and the boy he used to be before the world made him hard and cruel. The silence in Romano's restaurant stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Maya sat at the piano bench with her hands in her lap, suddenly aware that dozens of people were staring at her. She had been so lost in the music that she had forgotten about the audience, forgotten about Richard's cruel demands, forgotten about everything except the conversation between her heart and Chopin's beautiful composition. Then, like thunder breaking after lightning, the applause began. It started with one person clapping slowly, then another. Then suddenly the entire restaurant erupted in appreciation. Customers who had been strangers moments before were on their feet, applauding with genuine enthusiasm for what they had just experienced. The restaurant staff joined in, their faces showing amazement and pride for their co-worker who had just revealed herself to be so much more than anyone had imagined. Maya stood up from the piano bench, overwhelmed by the response. She had played that piece hundreds of times during her student years, but never had it felt so personal, so connected to her deepest emotions. Tears were flowing down her cheeks as she tried to process what had just happened. But the most shocking thing in the room wasn't the standing ovation or Maya's tears. It was Richard Blackwell, the cruel billionaire who had forced this moment to happen, sitting at his table with tears streaming down his face, looking like a man who had just seen a ghost from his past. Richard's business associates were staring at him in confusion and alarm. They had never seen their ruthless boss show any emotion stronger than anger. The man who had built an empire by destroying other people's lives was crying like a child, completely overwhelmed by what he had just heard. "Richard, are you all right?" one of his associates asked quietly, afraid that other people in the restaurant might notice their powerful boss in such a vulnerable state. Richard couldn't answer. He was lost in memories of his mother playing that same piece on their old upright piano in the tiny apartment where he grew up. He could almost smell her perfume, almost feel her gentle hand on his shoulder, as she taught him to appreciate the beauty of classical music. She had died when he was 12, and he had spent the next 43 years building walls around his heart to make sure he never felt that kind of pain again. The music had torn down those walls in less than 15 minutes. Maya walked slowly, back toward Richard's table, unsure what to expect. The man who had threatened to destroy her career just minutes earlier now looked broken and vulnerable. She had no idea that her performance had awakened something in him that had been sleeping for decades. "Sir?" Maya said softly. "Are you okay?" Richard looked up at her through his tears, seeing her clearly for the first time all evening. Not as a servant or an employee or someone beneath his notice, but as a human being with extraordinary talent and a gift that had just changed his life forever. "That piece," Richard said, his voice barely a whisper. "My mother used to play it." Maya felt her heart soften with understanding. Music had a way of connecting people across all the barriers that usually kept them apart. Money, social class, age, life experience. In that moment, she wasn't a waitress and he wasn't a billionaire. They were just two people who had been touched by the same beautiful piece of music. "It was her favorite," Richard continued, wiping tears from his eyes with shaking hands. "She died when I was young, and I made myself forget the music. I thought it would hurt less if I didn't remember." The restaurant was beginning to return to normal as other customers went back to their meals and conversations, but Maya remained standing beside Richard's table. Something important was happening here. Something that went far beyond the employer-employee relationship that had defined their interaction up until now. "I'm sorry for your loss," Maya said simply. "And I'm sorry if the music brought back painful memories." Richard shook his head. "No, don't apologize. It wasn't painful. It was beautiful." I had forgotten what it felt like to remember her with love instead of just sadness. His business associates were completely bewildered by this transformation. The Richard Blackwell they knew didn't apologize to anyone, didn't show weakness, and certainly didn't have emotional conversations with restaurant staff. They sat in uncomfortable silence, unsure how to react to this unprecedented situation. "I owe you an apology," Richard said to Maya, his voice getting stronger. "What I did tonight was wrong. I bullied you into playing when you didn't want to, and I threatened your job when you tried to say no. That was cruel and unnecessary." Maya was stunned. She had never heard a wealthy customer apologize to a server before, especially not someone as powerful as Richard clearly was. "It's okay, sir. I understand you were disappointed about the music tonight." "No, it's not okay," Richard said firmly. "Nothing I was feeling justified treating you that way. You're clearly an incredibly talented musician, and I had no right to force you to perform for my entertainment." Richard stood up from his chair and turned to address the entire restaurant. "Excuse me, everyone," he called out, his voice carrying across the dining room. "I'd like to say something." Conversations stopped as people turned their attention to the man who had just been moved to tears by Maya's performance. Richard cleared his throat and looked directly at Maya as he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, we just witnessed something extraordinary tonight. This young woman is not just a talented musician. She's an artist who has the ability to touch people's hearts through her gift. I want everyone here to know that her performance tonight was nothing short of magical." The restaurant broke into applause again, and Maya felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment and pride. She had never expected public recognition for her music, especially not from the man who had seemed so cruel just minutes before. But Richard wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, quickly dialing a number while the restaurant watched in fascination. "Patricia, it's Richard Blackwell," he said into the phone. "I need you to cancel my morning meetings tomorrow. We have something more important to take care of." He hung up and turned back to Maya. "What's your name?" "Maya Rodriguez," she answered, still confused about what was happening. "Maya, I want to offer you something. I run a foundation that supports arts education and emerging artists. We provide scholarships for talented musicians who need financial help to complete their training. Would you be interested in finishing your musical education?" Maya felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. What? "Sir, I can't accept something like that from you." "Why not?" Richard asked. You clearly have exceptional talent that deserves to be developed. How much would it cost to complete your degree? Maya's head was spinning. I don't know. I'd have to apply again, and the tuition is very expensive, probably $50,000 or more. Richard waved his hand dismissively. That's nothing. Consider it done. But I want to offer you something else as well. He paused, looking around the restaurant before continuing. I want to hire you as the cultural director for my foundation. Your job would be to identify other talented young musicians who need support and to help create programs that bring music education to underserved communities. What do you think? Maya was crying again, but this time they were tears of joy and disbelief. An hour ago, she had been a struggling waitress afraid of losing her job. Now one of the richest men in the city was offering to change her entire life. I don't know what to say, Maya whispered. Say yes, Richard said with a smile. That was completely different from the cruel expression he had worn earlier in the evening. Let me help you share your gift with the world. Maya looked around the restaurant at her coworkers who were watching this incredible scene with amazement and happiness for her. She thought about her family back in Ohio, who still believed she was pursuing her dreams in New York. She thought about all the hours she had spent practicing piano as a child, dreaming of a moment exactly like this one. Yes, she said, her voice strong and clear. Yes, I accept. Richard turned to the restaurant manager who was standing nearby with his mouth hanging open. And I want to pay for everyone's meal tonight. Everyone in the restaurant. Consider it a celebration of Maya's incredible talent. The restaurant erupted in cheers and applause. Strangers were hugging each other. The staff was crying with happiness, and Richard was smiling more genuinely than he had in decades. 6 months later, Maya performed her debut solo concert at Carnegie Hall. Richard sat in the front row, beaming with pride as she played the same Chopin ballade that had changed both of their lives that night at Romano's restaurant. The program notes mentioned that her performance was sponsored by the Blackwell Foundation for Musical Arts, and that she was the foundation's first scholarship recipient and cultural director. After the concert, reporters asked Richard why he had decided to support unknown musicians. His answer was simple. Music has the power to remind us of who we really are underneath all our defenses and pretenses. Sometimes we need to be reminded that the most important things in life can't be bought or sold. They can only be shared. Maya never went back to waiting tables. Instead, she spent her days identifying and supporting other talented young musicians who needed help pursuing their dreams. The foundation grew rapidly under her,